It's chapter 12 time. We all ready? Let's see. A sentimental outing. When Papa was alive, we went together often to the Torquay Museum of Natural History, but I had not visited since his death. A fine, sharp needle twisted itself into my heart as Granny Jane and I stepped through the arched doorway and into the dimly lit foyer. "I know you have your special pets, Agatha, so off you go," said Granny Jane. "There is a great deal to discover by following one's own nose. When you've had enough, I shall be in the reading room with the botanical drawings." I went up the double staircase to the second floor exhibition hall, to where a person could look at bones and taxidermied animals. Papa had been the sort of museum visitor who paused before each glass case, perusing the contents, reading the cards of explanation, and examining the display again. But I was a roamer, ambling back and forth until something called out and demanded my notice. That's how I do museums too. I began with one of my favorites, the diorama of a lynx attacking a fawn. The lynx had long been extinct in England, but here it lived on in front of a stone castle with a drawbridge, painting on a backdrop to indicate the era during which the beast had wandered the countryside. The lynx, with a spotted golden coat and elegant ear tufts, had been modeled in a ferocious pounce, springing from behind wild privet made of plaster. The cat's claws torn to the hindquarters of a baby deer, leaving long bloody scratches in the fur. That's kind of gruesome. Looking closely, one can see that it was red paint dotting the stripes of the wound, but the effect from afar was deliciously gruesome. I imagined myself perched on a stool in a workshop, surrounded by pots of paint and glue, heaps of wood scraps, and a jar of brushes. Here she goes daydreaming again. Ready? The devoted artist wore a sturdy canvas apron with a special pocket for her hammer. The spectacles upon her nose glinted as she hummed, repairing the torn ear of a badger with careful stitches she imagined it had occurred during a duel with a raccoon. Each tug of the needle, each tap of the awl became part of the story she constructed. She's so silly. Papa's favorite was a snake, jaws agape, caught in the act of stealing an egg from the nest of a flustered mothered mallard. That's a duck. Papa laughed at the drake, cowering amongst the reeds while the female's beak and wings were wide open in maternal fury. I wandered past scenes featuring the gray wolf, the Canadian beaver, and the leatherback turtle, more disconsolate with every step. It wasn't as much fun being here without Papa. All the moments of my life, my poems, and my adventures from now until I was a wrinkly old woman, finally taking final breaths through yellow teeth, it would all unfold without Papa. How could I bear it? Hot tears pricked my eyes. I must bear it, that's all. There was no choice, so think about something else. Next time, I thought, Hector should come here with me. Which animal would be his favorite? I was certain he'd be pleased by the displays of bones as well. If only Charlotte weren't such a thorn to our friendship. We had so many other topics to discuss. A real newspaper reporter had sought my observations. If Leonard hadn't interrupted, I might have asked Mr. Fibley a few questions of my own. Like, how did a person go about writing a story when presented with so many threads to follow? And if the story involved a dead body, how did one decide which details were relevant and which might be crucial to solve a solution? I wiped my face with my sleeve. Was it possible that instead of needing distraction from the murder, I needed the distraction of the murder to help dispel the gloominess of a world without Papa? Granny Jane was in the reading room as promised, peering at a framed drawing on the wall. A burly man with untidy side whiskers stood nearby, murmuring instructions. "Lavandula," he said, "commonly called lavender, as you likely know, a member of the mint family, so the aromatic quality is of no surprise. The species shown here has pennantly toothed leaves, but this is not consistent across the genus." "Oh, hello, dear." Granny touched my arm. "You remember Mr. Tunweed, the museum botanist?" "Sir?" I bobbed slightly. "I am delighted to have you visit us again, Miss Morton. I believe your grandmother is finding me quite tiresome as a docent this afternoon." As a docent, is how you pronounce that. My grandmother's eyes confessed to tedium. I guided her to sit in a chair. Purpose overcame my usual wish to avoid a conversation. Here was an expert, presented on a platter. "Granny Jane already knows everything about buds and blossoms," I said, "and about knitting. But I have a question." The man brightened. Of course, Miss Morton. How may I help? I scanned the small gallery of drawings mounted on the one library wall not lined with bookshelves. Surely he would know about poisonous plants. How to ask without alarming my grandmother, though. Have you any drawings kept away out of sight? A tall wooden cabinet stood across the room with more than a dozen wide, shallow drawers. I am most particularly curious. I kept my voice only just above a whisper. About poisonous mushrooms. Among other poisons, I might have added, but did not. That's an eccentric interest for a young lady, said Mr. Tunweed. He cast a worried look in Granny Jane's direction. For the safety of my dog, I said. Tony is quite adventurous in his appetite and likes to eat all sorts of horrible things. Only yesterday we found a rabbit with a spongy little brain seeping out. Mr. Tunweed looked decidedly concerned. Oh, Tony didn't kill it. But he was keen to get close, you see, so perhaps I should know more about potential dangers in the garden. Said Mr. Tunweed. Cyanide? I said. Doesn't that come from a plant? The botanist coughed. Cyanide is present, he said, in many fruit stones and pits. Cherries, for instance, and apple seeds, though in very small quantities. I think your little doggie will be quite safe if you prevent his eating of fruit. Have you drawings of anything else I should watch out for? I asked. What does deadly nightshade look like, or opium? It was a welcome insight that once I'd launched a conversation, I could keep it going simply by asking questions. The botanist rolled open a drawer and showed me a detailed picture of a pale purple bloom. I've never been a dog who likes to eat flowers, he said, so I may assure you that Tony will not become a drug addict. This is known as Papaver somniferum, or the sleep-bringing poppy, used in the Far East to produce opium and morphine. What about strychnine? I said. In the Sherlock Holmes book, strychnine is very popular. Mr. Tunweed coughed again, a small bark, and peered across the room at Granny. I've heard that strychnine is often an ingredient in mouse poison, I said, coming finally to my intended destination. Could it be a coincidence that Roddy Fusswell and Miss Mary Ann had both complained of rodents on the night before the murder? That poison was on both their minds. Mice or rats? That would be perilous for a small terrier, would it not? Undoubtedly perilous. And part of that she was saying to herself, and part of that she said aloud to him. Undoubtedly perilous, said Mr. Tunweed, but the use of such a compound would normally be restricted to a cellar or a kitchen, not a concern with your dog in an outdoor garden. What might be the symptoms, I pressed, if such a substance were consumed? I'm wondering about something that might cause a person to become blue in the face when dead. A person? Alarm rang loud and clear in Mr. Tunweed's voice. Agatha, dear, said Granny Jane. Oh, dash it. How long had she been listening? I believe Mr. Tunweed is quite worn out from our visit this afternoon, and I'm feeling anxious for my tea. I was gracious with my thanks and my farewell. We got all the way to where Leonard was patiently waiting with the cart before the scolding came. I can see this outing was quite useless as a diversion from the fate of poor Irma Eversham. Granny Jane had to raise her voice because of the clopping hooves and the squeaking wheel. I don't suppose you learned anything of value? Not really, I said, but you should be applauding my efforts, dear Granny. My brain cell friction is at high velocity this afternoon. We arrived at the Royal Victoria Hotel with hearty appetites. The Royal Victoria Hotel high tea was a treat saved for rare and special occasions. I suppose that distracting a person from a murder investigation could be considered rare. How does a young lady feel about hot chocolate? Said Granny. A young lady, I said, feels particularly warmly about hot chocolate when it is garnished with a dollop of double cream. My favorite sandwiches were the cucumber with chopped chives and the ones with ham sliced as thin as onion skin. After sandwiches came cakes and tarts, plus an extra plate of scones and clotted cream with a pot of strawberry jam. I don't suppose the vicarage serves tea like this, I said. I wish Hector might have come. I expect that Hector attends school on a Monday afternoon, said my grandmother. I understand he's at the grammar on a scholarship. Oh, he's quite clever, I said, and quite a suitable friend, don't you think? Miss Graves appears to disagree on that point, Agatha, though I found him an appealing boy. Your mother will have the deciding vote, I dare say. Excuse me. I buttered a scone with a layer thick enough to look like cheese. Well, I think it's nice to have a friend and to be puzzling about chemistry instead of moping around. I said. I wish we knew for certain which poison was used. What do you think, Granny? It may surprise you to know that I'm not well schooled in poisons, Agatha, but I do recall a compelling case when I was younger, perhaps 30 years ago. A woman named Mary Ann Cotton was arrested for poisoning her stepson, a stepson from her fourth marriage. It came out during her trial, thanks to the dedication of newspaper reporters, that she had left a string of corpses in her wake. How many? I said. How did she do it? If I remember correctly, she killed 3 of her 4 husbands and 11 of her children. Holy guacamole. All with arsenic. The victims suffered what were called stomach fevers. It took years for Mrs. Cotton to be suspected. Her lawyer tried to suggest that the stepson died from inhaling the dye used to make the green wallpaper in their home. I licked a dollop of butter from my thumb. Stomach fever sounds slow, I said. I believe arsenic takes several days and is often mistaken for cholera or some such. Well, it wasn't arsenic from Mrs. Eversham then. She went ever so quickly. Does anyone blend poisons for speed and strength combined? Whew, your mother is quite correct that you are perhaps too entranced by morbid thoughts, said Granny, though it is a mysterious affair. I was quiet for a moment. I do not choose my thoughts, I explained after a while. They seem to choose me, like the lines of a poem. There was a poem, said Granny Jane, about Mrs. Cotton. Let me think. Most of it is gone. She tapped her forehead. But the last lines are memorable. You'll like this, Agatha. Mary Ann Cotton, dead and forgotten, lying in bed with her bones all rotten. She laughed and pleased with herself. I agreed that it was an excellent rhyme. What was Mary Ann's motive? I said. Was she simply seething with hatred? Hatred, no. It was more of a matter of greed. You likely are not familiar with the peculiars of life insurance, my dear. Back then it was quite a new idea. One could insure someone's life, like making a bet at the races, just for a few pounds. If the insured person died unexpectedly, the person making the bet would receive a sizable dividend. Mary Ann Cotton earned a substantial income by sacrificing her family members. She killed her own children and for money? I said. Such wickedness was inconceivable. Sherlock Holmes was right, I suppose. The motive is nearly always money in his cases. Murder and greed must be the best of friends, do you think? Money or terrible hurt, said Granny. She spread clotted cream on a corner of her scone. Or both together. Intimate companions, as you say. Do you suppose someone insured Mrs. Eversham's life? I asked. Despite our being inquisitive, certain details of a person's life are not any of her neighbor's business, said Granny Jane. If pressed, however, I would guess that no, the Evershams are not the sort of people who stoop to vulgar equations such as putting money value on human life. She rustled in her chair just enough to have the waiter spring to attention. She bade him bring the account, which means the check. I turned away from the view of rollicking waves on the sea to look at who else was lucky enough to take tea at the Royal Victoria on a Monday afternoon. Oh! I clamped a serviette over my mouth. That's him! Surely you meant to say that is he. It's the reporter, I whispered. Mr. Augustus Fibley, right there at the corner table. Granny Jane naturally could not writhe about in her chair to stare. And how did you become familiar with the appearance of a newspaper reporter? She said. Lying came more easily than I expected. Oh, he attended our Befriend the Foreigners concert. True, but false at the same time. He mentioned my poem in his little notice. Not my name, though. And then today, not to be boastful, I was in the headline. I quoted, Poison, vicious murder in the mermaid dance room, woman's body discovered by children. Remember? Torquay sways in fear. Scandal snake, said Granny Jane. He's talking to Ruddy Fusswell, I said, watching. Or rather, Roddy Fusswell was talking to him. The reporter is scribbling down things as speedily as anything. I pity our table is so inconveniently distant, said Granny Jane. She lifted her handbag from its hook under the table. Come along, Agatha. I should like to meet the young man who has been assigned to the mermaid room murder. Her face showed a grim resolve, except for the spark of mischief in her eyes. My sudden rise set the cake crumbs a-tremble. Granny stood more gracefully, causing the waiter to fly to her side, but she waved him away. The 2 men looked up as we approached. Roddy Fusswell's fuzzy lip made him appear older than clean-shaven Mr. Fibley, but I guess they were about the same age as Rose Eversham and my sister Marjorie. The reporter's schoolboy eyeglasses reflected darts of light from sunlight streaming through the windows. Roddy Fusswell rose nimbly to show respect for Granny Jane. I suppose he was polite every day to old ladies visiting the hotel. Mr. Fibley's chair made a dreadful scraping sound as he got awkwardly to his feet. I stammered out the introductions and didn't mix anyone up. "I do like to partake of the news," said Granny, "and even enjoy an occasional taste of gossip. But I must say that making one's living by nosing about in other people's business is rather steamy." Pink flared in Mr. Fibley's cheeks. Mr. Fusswell's went straight to red. "It's for a good cause, Mrs. Morton," he said. "I'm only talking to the chap because of Rose, just trying to set him straight about what a good egg she is." "Does Mr. Fibley have reason to believe that Rose Eversham is not a good egg?" Granny Jane turned her gaze to the reporter, using what I long ago dubbed the withering look. Mr. Fibley pushed his spectacles up to the bridge of his nose and blinked. "I am delighted to count you among my readers, Mrs. Morton," he said. "Most stories go deeper than just the facts, as you'll have noticed. In this case, I'm looking for motives, not necessarily visible on the surface of the things." "If Rose killed her mother, I could only wonder what took her so long," said Roddy. "That old woman was asking for something like this to happen, the way she bullied and bruised everyone who crossed her path, myself included." He smirked briefly. "But Rose most of all." Mr. Fibley's eyes shifted to the notebook open on the table. I sensed his fingers itching to write down what Roddy Fusswell had said. Was this an admission that Roddy had aided Rose in a homicide, and that he thought was justified because the victim was a nasty woman? But Roddy knew something that did Roddy know something else that no one else could know? Or was he slyly stirring up interest in someone other than himself? Granny Jane raised an eyebrow. "A word of advice, Agatha dear. As you go forward into the world, remember at all times with whom you are speaking and how your words may be interpreted by those hearing them." That's good advice, Mrs. Morton," said Mr. Fibley, "though I rather depend on people forgetting themselves in my company." And then he winked at me. "Now, just a minute." Roddy Fusswell finally understood they referred to his own brash comments. "If you think—" "Time to go," murmured Granny Jane. "Our curiosity is becoming unbecoming. You have a lovely tea room, Mr. Fusswell. We have enjoyed ourselves. Good day." "If you think what I just said about the old biddy means I offed her, you'd be dead wrong," said Roddy Fusswell. "If I were going to kill someone," he glared straight into my eyes, "I'd do it with my own bare hands." I wonder why he looked at Agatha for that. Yikes. That's into chapter 11. Into chapter 12.